Video games. It is a term that I have for a long time gravely disliked, and I wasn't exactly sure why. It always just didn't ring quite right in my ear, and I just didn't like it. However, a recent trailer that was released at the Paris Games Show really solidified in my mind why the term video game isn't actually accurate anymore, and I think actually is holding our industry back. Now, before getting into this, I do want to stress I understand that sometimes a term is coined and it just sticks even though it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for what we're discussing. Like a cell phone. We don't actually use these things primarily as telephones anymore. They can do that, for instance, but really they're personal computers in the form factor of a small handheld device. The term phone isn't quite accurate anymore, but it's stuck and everyone calls these phones or cell phones, so we just roll with it. And I understand to some extent that's what's happened with video games. The video games that we play today are nothing like the games we played 20 years ago or 30 years ago. Therefore, this video is somewhat irrelevant, but at this point, I just want to make and stress and see if you agree with me. Now, the first thing I want to do is ask you, the viewer, what you think of when the term video game is spoken. Do you think of a small game on a little handheld device when you were a kid that was just fun and it offered an escape from reality? Or do you think of these massive, vast exploration and adventure titles that allow you to escape into another world? Or these narrative titles that allow you to experience emotions and stories that you would never experience in your personal life, but they allow you to go somewhere and to feel things that you wouldn't be able to feel otherwise? Which is it? Do you feel all of those things? Do you feel just one of them? I think that that's an important thing to stress and to figure out before we go on to this. Because if you do feel that video games are just a fun escape from reality, that's okay. But for me and for many other gamers, video games in 2017 are capable of much more. Now, I mentioned that one particular video game trailer that debuted at Paris's Game Week really stood out to me and stood out to many people and sparked a lot of controversy as a result. And if you're not familiar with the game I'm referring to, it is Detroit Become Human. Simply put, this game is about three synthetic humanoid androids, essentially, that are becoming sentient and that are faced with very difficult moral choices, and the player, in turn, gets to make those decisions for the android, allowing the player to experience all of these branching narratives and to be forced to make these very difficult decisions as you go through the narrative of the game. And it's a really interesting idea. It's something that's been done before in varying degrees. It's similar to a game called Until Dawn, which was a horror game with big branching narratives based on your decisions. The difference is this game does not try to be a campy horror fun throwback game for parties. Instead, this game is trying to put you in very difficult moral situations and see how the player in turn responds. Now, already this is fairly different from a lot of video games that you're going to experience. Games typically throw you in a world and say explore or have fun or go through and solve these puzzles, blah blah blah. It's fairly straightforward and simple. Very few games, relatively speaking, offer you vast moral choices and offer consequences based on those choices that you make. Now, you may be thinking, what's the big deal? This just sounds like a cool idea for a video game, and it's something that I probably want to play. Well, that's true of me too, but the big problem for many people came when they watched the trailer and realized the themes that were actually being discussed in it. Now, for copyright purposes, I can't play the full trailer here, but essentially what happens is that in this trailer, we see an android that is effectively acting as a maid and a caretaker for a young girl working for the young girl's father, who is abusive and had his job taken away by another android, at which point this man's wife left him with this daughter all alone in this rundown house. He feels impotent, he feels incapable of controlling his own destiny, he starts drinking a lot, and it is heavily implied that he is strongly abusive and heavily abusive towards his daughter. Now, already we're discussing topics and emotions and themes that are so much darker than what you would typically expect to find in a video game. A game implies that it's going to be a fun sort of escape from reality, not something dealing with heavy, intense topics that are very, very serious and that thousands and thousands of kids and families deal with every single day. And it goes back to what I was saying earlier, where the term video game doesn't quite do this title justice. Now, the reason that this really struck me actually is because of what a journalist and Childline founder, essentially a nonprofit organization that's focused on helping kids who suffer from domestic abuse, said. This woman by the name of Dame Ranson said that Sony should actually remove the scene of child abuse from Detroit Become Human, or they should remove the game entirely and cancel it because, quote, violence against children is not entertaining. It's not a game. It's a real nightmare for thousands of children who have to live through these kinds of scenarios. The makers of this game should be thoroughly ashamed. I think it's perverse. Who thinks beating a child is entertainment? End quote. Now, she's actually right here. She is correct in that thousands and thousands of children have to deal with these very real situations on a daily basis, and that it isn't entertainment, and to glorify it would be perverse. All of that is correct, but that last sentence is what really stuck out to me. Specifically, who thinks beating a child is entertainment? And that's when I really started to think, are video games, quote unquote, purely entertainment, or are they at this point capable of doing something beyond just blindly entertaining people? Now, I'm sure I don't need to explain to you that there are thousands, if not millions, of people every year that lose themselves into imaginary worlds that exist within video games, exploring these worlds, interacting with the people within them, going and exploring, adventuring, having an amazing time, exploring something that doesn't actually, physically speaking, exist, but it still happens. And that, to me at least, goes beyond mild, bland entertainment where you sit in front of a TV and just absorb information. This is an experience. It's not just a game where you're playing, pressing buttons, expecting things to happen and getting rewards for it. It's something beyond that, something greater. I guess my point is that video games are no longer just a straightforward means of entertainment. They still can be, certainly, but they are also capable of going so much farther beyond that. However, there will still always be people who think that video games are not capable or have not earned the right or not legitimate enough to actually deserve the ability to describe and discuss these types of scenarios or themes. They think video games should be relegated specifically to simpler themes, simpler topics that are geared more towards children, should never discuss adult themes or topics. And that, I think, is a huge, huge mistake. I actually printed off and have been reading through interviews that GameSpot did with Detroit Become Human's director and writer, a man by the name of David Cage. And he actually had a brilliant answer to this specific question. Cage said, quote, I always considered that games and interactivity were a respectable medium and a form of expression as much as film or literature or theater or any other art form. And you can't say this and make games that don't reflect that. I try to put meaning in my games. Yes, I use violence, but it's not for the sake of violence. There is a meaning to this story. This android goes through the orders. I mean, she has orders. A human master tells her don't move, and she needs to go through this to free herself and really become who she is. And she does that through empathy and by love. And she wants to save this little girl. All this has a meaning, and this is only the beginning of a very long story that will take you to very different places. All this is important to us. We hope it's going to be meaningful to people. Yes, it's a difficult scene. Yes, it's oppressing. Yes, it's about domestic violence, but are games illegitimate to talk about these things? It's an interesting question. It absolutely is an interesting question, and it's one that I want you to ask yourself and ponder over the next few days or weeks or years, however long, but really think about video games as an artistic medium, just like painting or singing or film or writing a book or a novel. Is it capable of evoking the same emotions in you? For me, it certainly is. I've had some of the most emotional and significant reactions to stories through video games, not necessarily through novels or through a film or a song, but through video games. And for that reason, the term video game to me just doesn't do the medium itself justice. I don't know, hopefully this rambling made a little bit of sense. Basically, I understand that video games is just a term that has been assigned to this particular medium, but I think that it's holding it back, and I think video games are capable of so much more as long as we understand that they're capable of so much more. And with games like Detroit Become Human and The Last of Us and all these very narrative-heavy titles that discuss mature and adult themes, if we can understand that, respect it, and understand that this is just another form of art, and give these artists creative freedom to do and tell the stories they want to, I think we're going to see a renaissance and an incredible uprising of remarkable art and stories, narratives, and emotions that are told and expressed through this relatively new medium in the broad span of human history. And so at the end of the day, I suppose this video really is about just appreciating all of the art and effort that's demonstrated through this medium that we all know and love. I mean, really, imagine if painting or theater or writing were just invented 40 years ago, all of the incredible art we would be seeing. But the potential would still be there, and the best stuff surely would still be to come. And with video games, I think it's true. This medium is very fresh, and I think the best stuff is just on the horizon.